Hello there, and welcome to Lesson 7. In this lesson, we're going to continue our discussion of ancient Athenian drama. Last time we talked about the tragedies Oedipus and Antigone. Today we're moving on, and we're talking about another tragedy called Agamemnon, and then also a comedy, Lysistrata. And so that should be quite interesting. Looking forward to being able to take a look at a comedy, since we've seen a number of examples of tragedy. Tragedy is wonderful in so many ways, but it'll be good to laugh with you in the latter part of this lesson when we get to Lysistrata. And I'd like to also add that this will be our fourth and final lesson on the ancient Greeks. Remember, we spent 2 lessons on the epics, one on the Iliad and one on the Odyssey, and now we're spending 2 weeks on drama, which, in addition to the epics, drama is one of ancient Greeks' biggest contributions to the world in terms of literature. They had many other contributions in philosophy and other fields, but in literature, the epics and the dramas were their biggest contributions. And so we've got kind of this 4-week, 4-part study of ancient Greece. So after we wrap that up, in the next 2 final lessons, we'll focus on the Roman Empire. So we'll be moving from the Greeks to the Romans next. But first, we're going to take a look at one more tragedy in a comedy. The reason for this is I want you to really have a robust understanding of Athenian drama because it was so influential to the development of drama in the Western world. Agamemnon is actually one of the first tragedies we have. The playwright Aeschylus, who composed Agamemnon, is the of the Greeks whose works survived. Remember, not all their works survived. His are the oldest, and so in some senses it would have made sense to start with Aeschylus and Agamemnon rather than skipping ahead to Sophocles. But for our introduction to Athenian drama last time, I wanted you to read Oedipus and Antigone first, because those are the most famous, most classic examples. And Agamemnon, while an earlier piece and a very interesting piece, is not quite as robust and nuanced. It's still a wonderful play, but it doesn't quite hold up to the same high standard as Oedipus and Antigone. So now that you've really gotten in depth with Oedipus and Antigone, we can round out that discussion by looking at a couple of other works by a couple of other authors. And even though these 2 works might not be at quite the same level as what Sophocles produced, they're very good works in their own right. And by studying them, we'll, like I said, have a fuller picture of ancient Athenian drama. Okay, so that's the little introduction. Go. And like I said, the first one is Agamemnon, which is based on the character Agamemnon, right, from the Iliad, who you probably remember Achilles clashing with in the very first book of the Iliad. Well, like we've said a number of times, all of these stories, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Oedipus, Antigone, Agamemnon, all of these literary works are based on pre-existing folklore and mythology from the ancient Greek oral traditions. And so this is kind of another take on Agamemnon's character, telling us about a different part of his life, but coming from that same mythological. Here are recall questions, so some things to think about as you read, as we go through the lecture. You've already hopefully done the reading. So, as you look at these, you can just pause the lecture and jot down some notes and then kind of have those notes next to you as we go further into the lecture. But with Agamemnon, I ask, what are some of the important qualities and themes of Oedipus and Antigone? So this is a 2-part question. On the one hand, what are some qualities? So what was the plot structure like? What were the kind of the character development like? Kind of the more elemental or fundamental parts of the work. And then, I also ask, what are some themes? So what were the ideas or the philosophies present in the text? So qualities might be like that tragic plot structure where you have the character who makes a mistake and falls from grace, but then has recognition and catharsis. Themes might be things like blindness or suffering, or Oedipus is relatability, or family and Antigone, those kinds of things. And this is just to give you a really robust background because you're about to take a look at something similar yet a little bit different. Secondly, you could also jot down some notes on what you recall about the figure, the character of Agamemnon from when we read the Iliad. So what was he like? What was his personality like? And this will be useful because, like I said, you'll see a similar but slightly different take kind of coming at the character from a different angle by looking at a different phase of his life, but nonetheless the same figure from Greek mythology. So a little bit of review of him would be helpful. All right, let's take a little bit of a look at the background on the author, Aeschylus. He's, like I said a minute ago, the earliest Greek dramatist whose work survives. And so there may have been Greek playwrights before him, but we don't have any of their plays around still today. Remember, I think there are only 4 Greek playwrights who survive, which is really remarkable because the Greek drama had these few plays that do survive have, and by survive I mean the manuscripts of the other ones have been lost since they're several thousand years old. But Greek drama is so influential on drama throughout the rest of the Western world. I mean, Shakespeare, you've heard of Shakespeare, right, is the most famous playwright of all time, and his work is greatly indebted to Greek drama, especially tragedy. And so Aeschylus launched us off here. You know, he launched the tradition of Western drama. The Greeks basically invented drama, and as far as our records show, again, they don't reflect everything, but as far as they show, he was the first one, our author here, Aeschylus. One of his important innovations was that he added a second actor. Remember, there was that idea of the tragedy, and there was that actor Thespian was his name, or Thespis was his name, where we get the word thespian, and he stepped off the stage and invented the first actor. From historical records, we know a lot about the plays that were performed and how they were performed. We just don't have the actual manuscripts. And so of these very first plays of which we have a record here, we know that compared to earlier plays of which we no longer have the text, Aeschylus added this innovation where he added a second actor, which is really important because plays before this were all about the interaction between the actor and the chorus. And so once you add a second actor, and this is still very chorus heavy what we're reading, but once you add a second actor, you can have conflict between individuals rather than just between an individual and the chorus. And for tragedy, you need conflict between individuals. That's the heart of tragedy. That drives tragedy. And so you can make the argument that Aeschylus is the creator or the inventor of tragedy. I want to give you some background on the city of Athens now. Remember, Athens is where drama was invented and thrived. But Aeschylus lived during a huge time period of transition in Athens. And so there's a lot of important historical context here. So during his lifetime, Athens went from tyrant rule, which just means that one man was a ruler, one king or leader. It does not necessarily mean that that leader was a tyrant. In Greek, tyrant just meant one man rule. We've kind of taken that word today and in English, twisted it a bit to mean a bad leader, but they weren't necessarily automatically bad. It just meant it was a single rule. But during his lifetime, when Aeschylus was only 15 years old, Athens moved from this kind of leadership to a democracy, which is really interesting. Or ancient Greece, especially ancient Athens, had one of the earliest examples of democracy in the Western world. So what are some of the details? What was democracy like? That was a big deal. What was it like? They had a 50-member elected council, but women slaves and resident foreigners, so foreigners who'd lived there a long time, did not get to vote. So it was really innovative and interesting that they had this 50-member elected council, but not everyone could vote. So it was a democracy, but a democracy of a certain kind, you could say. One thing the democracy did do for the Athenians was it created a strong sense of community. Even if it didn't include everyone, it included more than one person. And so that, knit the community together to a certain extent. I'm sure there were exceptions, but overall, it created a sense of community and pride, which scholars attribute to their rise to power. Athens, as you'll see here and in the next part of the lecture as well, was an incredibly powerful city. I mean, you've heard of the Greek Empire, obviously. Athens itself was an empire. And some of the city-states, like Athens and Sparta, conquered territories and basically became their own empires, even though they were part of Greece. And we'll talk more about that when we study the play Lysistrata, because that play is about a war between Sparta and Athens. The Greek city-states became so powerful they actually fought with each other. But one of the reasons Athens became such a powerful one and was the most powerful one for a long time before they lost in civil war to Sparta is because of this sense of communal pride that, again, came from being a democracy. There are some other really interesting things in addition to the democracy that made Athens an interesting place for Aeschylus to live and that clearly influenced his writing. One is that they defeated the Persian Empire twice in battle to become the most dominant Mediterranean power. I mean, Greece was the most dominant Mediterranean power, but within Greece, Athens was the most dominant city-state. And so you've probably seen the movie 300 about the 300 Spartans who faced off against an army of, I think it was 1,000 Persians and fought very well for a long time. That captivating story that's very familiar is the second of these two battles I mentioned here. And if you remember that movie, they allude to the fact that the Spartans' sacrifice in the 300 standing up to the 1,000 Persians inspired Athens to join in the battle. And Athens had this incredibly powerful navy. So even though the Persian Empire, by sheer numbers, finally defeated the 300 Spartans, they eventually lost this battle because they had to contend with Athens' navy. That's how powerful Athens' navy in their city-state was. And Aeschylus, our playwright, had a front row seat to this because he served in the military and received honors and awards. He was distinguished in combat. And we know for sure he fought in the first of these two conflicts because we have the records. We don't have the records to prove, but scholars are pretty confident he also served in the second conflict where their navy defeated the specific Persian army that faced off with the 300 Persians. But his brother fought in combat alongside him the first time and actually lost his arm in battle. And because of that, he died of the wounds. Back then, you couldn't repair the wounds when you lost a limb like that as quickly. So because of infection and stuff, he died. So Aeschylus was this grizzled combat veteran who received awards, but also knew the pain and suffering of war because he lost his brother in the war. And so when you get to him writing a character like Agamemnon, that's incredibly interesting to think about, because Agamemnon is this man who has survived 10 years of the Trojan War. And so a lot of Aeschylus' plays were about military encounters. In fact, his very first tragedy, again, we don't know if it's the first one he wrote, but it's the oldest surviving one he had. So I'm calling it his first tragedy. If he wrote any earlier ones, those manuscripts are lost to the sands of time. But his first one is called Persians. And it tells the story of these military conflicts with Persia. What's interesting, though, is he's got this combat experience, and he writes about battles, but he, like Sophocles, who wrote Oedipus and Antigone, is also very philosophical and very into the character depth and development. So he actually tells the story from the perspective of the Persians, which seems kind of odd. That right there already adds some psychological depth to the characters, but he does make it a sort of an ideological text, and that he basically argues that democracy is better and that the Persians lost because they did not have a democracy. So he's really, in this literary text, his first play, really arguing for the sense of community I mentioned above. And it's fascinating because you have this guy who lived and fought in wars now giving you complex characters with psychological depth, as we'll see when we study Agamemnon. And if you remember from the previous lecture when I was introducing Athenian drama, they had that ancient festival, the Great Dionysia, where they would perform these plays. That's kind of how the tradition of drama started. Persians won first prize at the Great Dionysia, as so did several other of Aeschylus's plays. And so he became incredibly famous, not only in his own lifetime, but further on, because he invented the concept of a second actor, and he invented tragedy. And so we would not be where we are today. We would not have plays like Shakespeare's Othello or King Lear or Hamlet or Macbeth, which are incredibly powerful tragedies, if we wouldn't have Oedipus, which is shortly after this, if Aeschylus hadn't laid the groundwork here with these innovations. So a little bit about Aeschylus. Let's turn to the reading questions, and then we'll take a look at the play itself. So my first question is that think about Clytemnestra here. I usually always ask for the first reading question, what do you think of the main character? Well, Clytemnestra is really the main character, right? Because Agamemnon, he's in it, he's interesting, but he's not there that much. And so what do you think of her? Now, right in a row, right after Antigone, we've got some female protagonists, and we will in just a minute here when we get to the comedy Lysistrata. And so what do you think of these female protagonists, comparing, contrasting them, especially Clytemnestra? Hopefully you thought about this while you were reading. This is a question we'll come back to in a different form when we get to the learning questions for the discussion board. Secondly, the events of the play unfold rather slowly and subtly, kind of builds up. You sort of know what's coming, right? Like you can kind of anticipate that this is going to really ultimately all just build to the murder of Agamemnon. It's a very straightforward play in that sense, but on the way to Agamemnon's murder, you get a lot of interesting detail about the characters and their nuances, and there's a lot of foreshadowing. There's subtle hints and details that lead up to that. So what kind of tipped you off? If you didn't know this play was ultimately about a murder and going to end in a murder, what did you think leading up to it? Like, when did you put it together? What were the clues? And this can help you see how the drama works. Remember how Aristotle talked about dramatic effect? And in Oedipus, again, if you don't know the story, it's pretty shocking when you find out what happened, but it's building to that, and there's times when you might be able to figure it out. This is similar. It's rather than a revelation of what has happened like in Oedipus, it's a revelation of what's going to happen. Agamemnon and Cassandra's murders at the hands of Clytemnestra. So just kind of looking at those details as you read, kind of, figuring it out. All right, so those were things that hopefully were helpful to you while you read, and hopefully you took notes, and so you can kind of take those notes out now and put them side by side with your recall question notes, and you'll be ready to rock as we go through the play. So before we look at some language from the play and do our close reading, I want to talk about how this play is part of a trilogy. I think that's crucial to understanding the meaning of it. And so much as I gave you kind of a plot summary of the Iliad and the Odyssey when we studied those texts, although this play itself is a very straightforward, simple plot compared to those, it's part of a 3-act series here. It's a trilogy. And so knowing what happens in the other plays, even though we didn't read those, I think will be really helpful for seeing how this piece fits in to the larger trilogy and how some of the themes that start to emerge here are fleshed out more fully in the full trilogy. And so this is the Oresteia trilogy, and it's based, or that name comes from the main character of the second piece from the trilogy, Orestes, who's Agamemnon's son, one of his other children. And so each of these 3 plays in this trilogy, each of them is about a murder, and then kind of a murder in response to a murder. Like it's a sequence of one murder or violent act, you could say, leading to another. So something violent or murderous happens, and then the play builds up to something similar happening. So it's like violence returned for violence, and that's just a cycle that continues. And one of the major themes here is how life and suffering are cyclical. And that's, you might ask, why would Aeschylus write 3 plays with essentially the same plot? A murder for another murder, repeat, is essentially the plot, if you want to sum it up, of the Oresteia trilogy. And so why would he do that? Well, it's to illustrate how violence begets violence, and how once one partakes in violence, it can begin a vicious cycle. And it raises the question of, what do you have to do to break that cycle? So if we look at the trilogy as a whole, we can start to see that. In Agamemnon, there's actually 3 acts of violence that lead to Clytemnestra's murder of Agamemnon. And the first one is obvious, the others might not be so. So I want to go through them. And most of this you get explained via the chorus as like background. So the first is Paris's abduction of Helen, because that launches the Trojan War. And so there's a sequence of violent acts here, one leading to the other. So Agamemnon's brother Menelaus is Helen's husband, and so he's the commander of the Greek army here. So he wants the Achaeans, that particular sect of Greeks, and so he's going to lead them into battle to get his brother's wife back. So it's cause and effect. In the first violent act, Paris's violent abduction of Helen. Remember, it's against her will. It's not romantic like in the movies. He thinks he's entitled to just take her because of what the gods had orchestrated. And so Paris's abduction of her leads to the Trojan War. But as the Greeks are sailing to the Trojan War, the winds stop. And one of the gods demands that Agamemnon murder his own daughter. And that's the only way this god will restore the winds and actually be able to move their ships all the rest of the way to Troy. And so Agamemnon feels like he has no choice. I mean, he's committed his army, and so he makes his choice and he kills his own daughter. So that's the second, violent and heinous crime. The third one is Atreus, Agamemnon's father, tricks his brother, so that'd be Agamemnon's uncle, Thyestes, into eating his own sons. So he's like, Atreus, Agamemnon's father, is like cooked up his 2 nephews in a stew or something, and then he serves it to Thyestes, and he eats it. He doesn't know what the meat is in it. He doesn't know it's actually the flesh of his sons. It's really awful. The Greeks didn't have any issues with violence. Let's put the violence in the plays. You read Oedipus, right? So anyway, so that's why Aegisthus, Clytemnestra's lover, and Agamemnon's nephew, that's why he's eager to get revenge here. And so that's kind of the other half of it, right? Clytemnestra is the main character, and Aegisthus doesn't show up till the end, but then he has an important role once he does show up. So he's also getting revenge here. So you have the sequence of Paris setting off the Trojan War, Agamemnon killing his own daughter so he can get to Troy for the war, and then his own nephew seeking vengeance, not for something he did, but for something his father did. And this again comes back to the idea of violence begets violence, and it's cyclical. So there's the phrase used throughout the play, the curse of Atreus, or the curse on the house of Atreus. Their house, their estate where they live, is named for Agamemnon's father. That if you didn't know who Atreus is, that clears that up. And so it's this curse that begins when Atreus, serves up the 2 boys in the stew to his brother. That's how it begins. And then it just continues on. It's the curse is part of what leads to Agamemnon killing his own daughter, and then vengeance begets vengeance, so on and so forth. And so it's cyclical. So the question then is, how does this curse play out in the other 2 plays of the trilogy? So the second play is called The Libation Bearers, and that one is about Agamemnon's son, Orestes, killing his mother, Clytemnestra, to get vengeance for Agamemnon's murder, which happens at the end of this play that we're reading, Agamemnon. And so it's a cycle, and it continues. The interesting thing, though, about Orestes is, again, there's psychological depth here, with most of these characters, we can half understand their motivation. Agamemnon killing his own daughter is horrible, but he sees it as the only way to get his troops to Greece. Clytemnestra and Aegisthus murder Agamemnon but we can kind of see why, right? He murdered her daughter, right? So the one hand, it's murder, and it's a crime, but on the other hand, it's sort of justified. And so there's always that duality in each of these plays with the crimes. But that duality, that tension between, you can understand why the person would kill the person, kind of holding that in tension with the fact that they're committing murder, that tension becomes and runs even deeper in the second play, The Libation Bearers, because Orestes, he doesn't own the murder of Clytemnestra the way she is. Like, Clytemnestra's like dancing and celebrating at the end of this play. But in The Libation Bearers, Orestes is reluctant to kill his mother. And his sister, Electra, and his cousin Pylades basically talk him into it. They convince him to do it. And so, that's a little bit different. So the motive for murder, the choice to do it's a little more complicated in The Libation Bearers. So you have this same cycle of violence begets violence, and of the duality of understanding a little bit of the motive behind the crime, but it's still a crime. You have those two main themes complicated by Orestes' lack of conviction, lack of willingness to kill his mother, and then that comes full circle, really plays out in the third and final play, which is called the Eumenides. And in that, this group of goddesses hunt Orestes, and they're trying to punish him for killing Clytemnestra. But here's where it gets in. So that seems like the same thing, right? Violence begets violence. But here's where it becomes interesting. Athena, the goddess, intervenes before the Furies can kill Orestes. And Athena establishes a judicial system, like a court of law, basically. And she puts Orestes on trial. But because of the way he was not duped, but persuaded, I guess it would be a better term, by Electra and Pylades, Athena decides he's not guilty, and she lets him go, even though he did kill his mother. And so he is free, and the cycle of vengeance killings ends. That cycle of violence begets violence ends with the trial and the not guilty verdict in the third and final play of the trilogy. And so what's really interesting is you have a cycle of violence. So you have violence, vengeance, and I would say the two things that are in conflict are vengeance and justice, right? When we say a murder is a murder, we're saying Clytemnestra is acting out of vengeance. When we say, I can really see why Clytemnestra killed Agamemnon. I mean, he killed their daughter. Then we're talking about justice, right? She wants justice for her daughter. And so when we talk about these two sides of Clytemnestra's character and of the duality in the play, what were the two things that are in tension, that we're holding in tension, what they really are, we can very easily label them as vengeance and justice. And so you have violence begins violence in all three plays. You have, because of the curse, so violence and curse, and then you have vengeance and justice and tension. What breaks the tension and breaks the cycle is law. You institute a system of law where you can evaluate, and a judge says, I decide this person is not guilty. He was influenced and persuaded. That adds a new element. That breaks the cycle. And so it's really interesting to mull over. Obviously, we only read Agamemnon for the lesson. We only have time to read two plays, and I wanted you to also read a comedy. We don't, in the textbook doesn't even have all three plays, but I wanted to give you this background because as you think about the discussion board questions and think about what you want to write on for this, you can keep in mind the events of the other plays and bring them up if you want. And if you want, especially if you write your paper on this, you can also read those plays in your own time. They're fascinating to study. They're great reads. Okay, so let's look at some actual passages of language from the play. And we're going to go over some themes first, kind of building up to that. So I just outlined the important themes of the play for you. I'm going to recap them real quickly. Vengeance and justice are the two main ones. What is the difference between these two? What is vengeance? And why does that have maybe a somewhat negative or less noble connotation? And what is justice? And why do we think that if a killing is a vengeance killing, we can maybe understand it? We don't always agree with it. If a killing is a justice killing, we usually say, well, that's okay then, that's acceptable. And so we can go so far even to question those definitions, but just more basically thinking about, what are the differences between vengeance and justice, and which of the crimes in the play? Because remember, there's actually 4, right? If we think about the context, we don't even have to think about the whole trilogy, although you can think about that too. But even just this play, there's Paris taking Helen, Agamemnon killing his daughter, Atreus serving up his nephews to his brother, and then finally, Clytemnestra's murders of Agamemnon and Cassandra. And maybe Agamemnon leads more towards justice. Maybe Cassandra leads more towards vengeance. She seems like a fairly innocent character. So we'll talk about all of this in more detail as we go through the quotes, but those are the things to think about with vengeance and justice. Law is another theme. We don't really see law here, but when I talked about the whole trilogy, law is what breaks the cycle. And so it's another important thing to consider. Moral responsibility, all these themes are interrelated, interconnected. So this one really relates to vengeance and justice, right? Like, how responsible, morally speaking, is Clytemnestra, right? We can see why she kills Agamemnon. Should she still be held morally responsible? It's a complicated question. It becomes even more complicated when you ask it about Cassandra, right? It's pretty easy to like Clytemnestra and to agree with her decision to kill Agamemnon. It's a lot harder to do that when we get to Cassandra. Another theme is the curse of the house of Atreus, right? So this is just something to think about. This curse goes from generation to generation, right? Agamemnon's father had his horrible crime. Agamemnon has his crimes. His son Orestes has his crime where he kills Clytemnestra. So it just continues on and on until law breaks that cycle. Another theme to think about. And then finally, one theme I haven't mentioned yet, so pay close attention here, that's really important, is the idea, the idea that through wisdom comes suffering. This is mentioned several times in the play. Well, that's a bad spelling or sentence structure on my part. It should be, through suffering comes wisdom. That makes a lot more sense, and I do apologize for that. Through suffering comes wisdom. So it's a question you could ask any time of tragedy, and it's what Aristotle's getting at when he talks about recognition and catharsis. Why would we read something where characters suffer so very much? Why read all this painful, depressing stuff? And why put the characters through this? Well, Aeschylus is putting forth the idea in this play that it makes us wiser, makes us smarter. We learn through suffering. It was a Greek idea, but it's also kind of a Christian idea. In the Bible talks about suffering building character, which we already discussed a little bit in lesson 2. So it's a challenging concept, because we would want to say, well, there should be no suffering in the world. And then you ask, well, where does wisdom come from? And could we have wisdom without suffering? How much do we learn and grow when we suffer? So a few things to think about there. And the Greek words pathos and mathos come to mind. Pathos means suffering and mathos means wisdom, but they rhyme with each other, which is very interesting. And so early on in the play, there's this opening scene with like the watchmen looking out, and you have the chorus speaking, and that's kind of all the buildup before Clytemnestra finally steps on the scene and you see and hear her for the first time. And so one of the last things the chorus says before Clytemnestra steps on the scene is, "But justice turns the balance scales, see that we suffer and we learn, and we will know the future when it comes." So just one early instance of this idea that through suffering comes wisdom. And the question we'll have to ask that we'll come to on the discussion board is it worth it? Is the payoff worth it? Do we learn enough to say that I can see why and understand why there is suffering in the world, and that it's almost better that there's suffering in the world because we wouldn't learn and grow without it. That's a not nearly impossible question, but one of the most important questions to answer. And does this play teach us that or not? We have to ask that too. Does it teach us anything beyond just how to suffer? Does it teach us something greater, something we can learn and apply beyond situations in which we're suffering? Okay, let's look at a couple longer quotes from the play here. I mentioned before, one of the great things about Aeschylus and his writing was that he introduced the second character, and he invented second actor, and he invented tragedy when he did that, because you have to have the rapport back and forth between two characters to have tragedy, that conflict. And so the scene we're about to look at is called Astychomythia, which is where two characters speak really fast, back and forth, like one line at a time. You know, you're used to Oedipus, where Oedipus has a long speech, and then Creon has a long speech, or Jocasta or Tiresias has a long speech. Here it's boom, 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 back and forth. Now, there's a lot of long speeches in this play, too, but the Stichomythia technique was more unique to Aeschylus than Sophocles, and so I want to show it to you. And there's one of the most famous scenes in the play is where Agamemnon arrives home, and Clytemnestra is like, walk across these robes I've laid on the ground. And he's like, no, that'd be offensive to the gods. And she's like, come on, do it, and kind of eggs him on and gets him to do it. And that's foreshadowing, because it is offensive to the gods. And they're like these crimson robes. They kind of look like blood. And pretty soon, at the end of the play, blood is pouring out of the house. So this scene is one of those hints, or one of those clues I mentioned, that alludes to what happens later on. And what I think is really interesting here is we get some insight to Clytemnestra's character, because I asked, what is she like? What do you think of her? And seeing how she's able to get him to walk across the cloaks, even though that's offensive to the gods, excuse me, that shows you a lot about her character. So pay attention in the scene and think about how she gets him to do this. That will teach you a lot about Clytemnestra. So Clytemnestra says, one more thing, be true to your ideas and tell me. True to my ideals. Once I violate them, I am lost. Would you have sworn this act to God in a time of terror? Yes, if a prophet called for a last drastic rite. But Priam, can you now see him if he had your success? Standing on the tapestries of God, I see him now. And you fear the reproach of common men. The voice of the people, aye, they have enormous power. Perhaps, but where's the glory without a little gall? And where's the woman in all this lust for glory? But the great victor, it becomes him to give way. Victory in this war of ours, it means so much to you. Oh, give way. The power is yours if you surrender all of your own free will to me. So you can see the rapport back and forth, the verbal banter here. Much like we had long speeches in Oedipus, we have shorter dialogue here, but there's still that back and forth, that conflict between characters. So a couple interesting things. I really think the line where she says, would you have sworn this act to God in a time of terror is interesting, because, he killed their daughter, his own flesh and blood, because he thought it was the only way to get to Troy. And that was worked out by the gods when they took away and then promised the return of the wind the men needed to sail, based on this act of violence. So she's like saying, in a time of terror like that, would you do what the gods say? And he is saying, yes, if a prophet called for a last drastic rite, I would. He's saying, I won't walk across these cloaks because it's offensive to the gods. And she's saying, what if a god told you to, like when you killed her daughter? And he's saying, well, if a god told me to, then I would. And so she's really pushing on, questioning his past choices, trying to force him to think about them. And then so that's one thing she does. Then another thing she does is she kind of goads him and tries to bring down his self-esteem. And remember, Priam was the leader of the Trojans, the king of the Trojans. And Agamemnon is victorious here. The Greeks have won the war, and he's just returned home from that. So she's saying, like, don't Don't you think Priam would be willing to do this, that he wouldn't be afraid of it? And so she goads him there. And then third, finally, the way she really lands the blow is she says, but where's the glory without a little gall? So she's saying, risk it for the biscuits. I know you might offend the gods here, but you just won a war. You should be pretty confident you can walk across these cloaks. And she wins this verbal back and forth. She wins it because he walks across the cloaks. And you know once he does that, he's going to die. So here we got a lot of insight to Clytemnestra's character. We're going to look at one last quote here before we move on to the discussion board questions, the learning questions. And this quote will tell us more about Clytemnestra's character, but it will also give us some insight to Aegisthus, who's the only main character we really haven't talked about yet. And the thing I want you to think about here is these are the final lines of the play. These are the last 12 lines of the play. After this, it ends. And so remember, I said it's part of a trilogy. And that trilogy is about the cyclical nature of violence. Violence begets violence. So think here about how this alludes to being part of a trilogy, because we're only reading one play, but you want to be able to think about some of the themes I mentioned when I outlined the trilogy as a whole. So keep that in mind. And again, there's multiple characters talking here. So it starts with Aegisthus, and he's kind of reacting to the people in the community seem upset that they've killed Agamemnon. So he's responding to the villagers there. But these mouths that bloom in filth, spitting insults in my teeth, you tempt your fates, you insubordinate dogs, to hurl abuse at me, your master. And so the chorus represents the people of the town. And so now the leader is speaking on behalf of the chorus. And he says, no Greek worth his salt would grovel at your feet. I'll stalk you all your days. Not, and then, so Aegisthus says back, I'll stalk you all of your days. But he's kind of wavering there, saying, so he's a little scared. Aegisthus is just taken over as leader now that Agamemnon's dead. And the people are upset that Agamemnon's been killed. I mean, they don't know all the details. Agamemnon just returned home victorious from war. And so Aegisthus lacks a little confidence here. He's a little worried about the people. So he's like, I'll stalk all your days. And then the leader of the people says, not if the spirit brings Orestes home. So there's a kind of illusion here. If this were a modern day movie, this would be like the end credits scene, and people would be waiting and hoping for the arrival of Orestes. And so there's a hint that someone will come and take revenge. And then Aegisthus says back, exiles feed on hope, well I know. And the leader says more, gorge yourself to bursting, soil justice while you can. He's saying, take advantage of this moment. It won't last. Vengeance is coming. And then Aegisthus says, I promise you, you'll pay old fools in time, too. Strut on your own dunghill, you cock beside your mate. Bold words from the leader. Finally, Clytemnestra speaks. Let them howl, they're impotent. You and I have power now. We will set the house in order once for all. So like I said, Clytemnestra and Aegisthus are really relishing the moment. They've achieved what they wanted. She wanted vengeance, but she also wanted power. Now she's queen and leader. She was queen before, but she's the leader now. And she has her young lover by her side, and they're going to rule together. So they're on top of the world. Even though the chorus here is insulting them and telling them, watch out, your rule and reign you're so happy about, the power you've just gotten, it won't last. But she's saying they can't do anything against us, and it's true they can't. These are just words. But Orestes can. That's the hint, right? And she says, we will set the house in order once for all, which is interesting because there's been this curse from Agamemnon's father, right? So she's saying, we'll set the house in order. Well, with what we know about the next play, we know that she doesn't. We know the curse isn't broken until the third play, until there's a court of law. And so she thinks they'll set it in order, or she believes they will. She thinks she just having the right ruler will make the difference. But we see that she committed murder to get here. So in many ways, she's just as corrupt as Agamemnon or as Atreus. There may be gradations. We might be able to understand her motives more. Her crime might be a little less despicable. But she still committed murder. She's still hungry for power. That's not enough of a difference to break the curse. Maybe Orestes's lack of conviction about being willing to commit murder might be, but truly what we need is a court of law to break this cycle. A lot of interesting stuff here. I'm going to really fast, to not keep you too much longer, run through the discussion board questions. So that question of vengeance and justice. Which acts of violence, because there's 4, are vengeance and which are justice? You don't have to cover all 4, but what I'm looking for here is maybe at least 2, or at least some kind of discussion of the difference of these 2 in essentially which crimes here seem more, if any of them, understandable. Maybe they're all violence and none of them are justice, but that's up for you to explain. I'd love to hear what you think. And then obviously the next question, the Clytemnestra character evaluation, that's essential. Really, there's 2 ways, 2 extremes. Think of a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, there's a sympathetic mother seeking justice for her daughter. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's a power-hungry, murderous adulteress. Now, I don't think either of these is a perfect characterization. Where Clytemnestra falls on the spectrum is probably somewhere in the middle, but I'm looking for you to place her there. I mean, we can really see why she would want vengeance. I mean, her spouse killed her child, and he's brought home his mistress from the war. But at the same time, she's in her own adulterous relationship, and clearly part of her motivation is to take the throne. Like, it's not solely because he killed her daughter. That's only a part of it. So how do you factor in all these variables? It's an incredibly complex character that she is. And once you factor in all those variables, where do you see her? It's that question of that theme of moral responsibility. How guilty is she or not? It's up to you to decide. Consider Cassandra's character, right? We haven't talked about Cassandra at all, so it might be worthwhile to discuss her on the discussion board. And I think this is what makes it hard, right? I mean, Agamemnon shouldn't be bringing his mistress home, although the Greeks just did that, but he shouldn't be doing that. But this girl is just this Trojan princess who's basically been kidnapped because this old guy, is attracted to her. And I don't know, she doesn't really seem like she's there of her own free will. And so it's not like she's like a gold digger or something, right? She was a princess in Troy. And so the fact that Clytemnestra is willing to kill this innocent girl who's a stranger in a strange land, see, if we didn't have Cassandra, this would be a more straightforward play. We'd be very sympathetic to Clytemnestra, but good old Aeschylus throws Cassandra in there because he doesn't want to make it easy on us. Like true tragedy, he wants characters of psychological depth and complexity. And so it's a lot harder to answer question 2. It's a lot harder to evaluate Clytemnestra because of Cassandra's presence and death. We'll keep going through the characters here. Consider Aegeus. And basically the same question about him as Clytemnestra. We have less on him. He's less central to the play, but it's a similar dichotomy where we can see how he's power hungry and wants vengeance, but he also wants justice for his brothers and his father. And so where do you place him on that? I'm going to call it the spectrum of moral responsibility. Question 2, where do you put Clytemnestra on that? Question 4, where do you put Aegeus on that? For number 5, we come back to that big theme I mentioned of through suffering comes wisdom. So some scholars who are not as favorable to this play say all you really learn here is how to suffer. There's nothing beyond dealing with suffering this play teaches us. And so I'm asking if it teaches us something more. By seeing the characters suffer here, are you able to take a lesson from this play and apply it to your own life Maybe when you're not even going through these kinds of things, or not even anything really that bad at all, but just kind of general life lessons? Or is this a play that is only helpful to people who are already suffering greatly? This is an important question, because I think this play, like I said, it's a wonderful play in many ways, but the literary value and impact of it is not as immediately clear as it is with Oedipus. There's so much with Oedipus and Antigone that we learn and can apply, and we can really see the dramatic effect and the purpose of tragedy in those two plays. I think it's not as immediately clear with this play. And so I think this is a question about how important is this play? Should it hold up over the test of time? I'm really curious to know your thoughts on that. So at the end, Clytemnestra claims that she and Aegisthus will put the house of Atreus in order once for all. But we know Orestes comes back and kills her in book or part 2. So we know that's not what happens. They don't actually put the house in order. They're not virtuous enough or noble enough to do it. So my question is, what could actually end the curse? And I mentioned how the third play has the court of law, and Orestes is a more sympathetic character than Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, though they are sympathetic in their own ways. But it's not just simply a court of law. That's just something I've told you. Like, really think about this. Like, thinking about everything you see and read in this play, what, if anything, could truly break this curse? So, play gives us a lot to think about. I look forward to reading your answers.